Growing up, I never expected how much my life would change. In a small, tight-knit town, I was the odd one out, more focused on school than fitting in. While my classmates were into sports and parties, I was absorbed in books and computer programming. During this time, I found my passion for business, though most people just saw me as the quiet, nerdy guy. Despite my shyness, I couldn't ignore Beverly, the girl everyone admired. She was everything I wasn't: confident, popular, always in the spotlight. I never imagined we'd connect. But life has a way of surprising you. Years later, that untouchable girl became my wife. To understand this, you need to know a bit about me. I'm Cliff Chandler. In high school, I was labeled a nerd. Beverly, whom I now call Bev, was the head cheerleader and prom queen, practically royalty in our school. She was dating Buster Snipes, the football captain, and though I thought he was a fool, they made a striking couple. I wasn't part of their world, but I heard the rumors about their wild behavior at parties. After high school, I went on to get an MBA at the University of Virginia. In the MBA program, I became close with my business finance professor. After graduating, I returned to Petersburg and worked at a small firm while developing software on the side. My professor heard about my project and encouraged me to start my own company, offering to help me get it off the ground. With his guidance, I set up a private corporation and my software took off, leading to a highly successful business. As the company grew, I hired my professor as a consultant. Around the same time, I ditched my wireframe glasses for contacts, and my MBA classes helped me build confidence. I learned to stand my ground, and in many ways, that marked the start of my transformation from a nerd to a businessman. About 4 months after starting my business, I visited a potential client and ran into Bev, who was the president's secretary. I recognized her immediately, but it took her a moment to remember me. We had a pleasant chat while I waited for my meeting, and I couldn't help but notice she was even more attractive than in high school. Before I left, we agreed to catch up sometime, though I didn't think much of it afterward. She seemed out of my league. A few weeks later, I returned for another meeting, and Bev mentioned she was disappointed we hadn't met up yet. I was surprised she remembered. A couple of weeks later, we finally got together. Our first meeting went so well that we started dating regularly. We had a lot in common and felt at ease with each other. She often remarked on how much I'd changed and regretted that we hadn't connected earlier. Though we didn't have sex, she introduced me to new sensations and wanted me to take her to bed, but I was raised to avoid premarital sex. We got married 7 months later. During our time together, she made it clear that she wasn't a maid, but I didn't mind. I couldn't believe someone like her would be interested in me. We had an early afternoon wedding, and our wedding night was planned in San Francisco, with a honeymoon in Hawaii the next day. That night, as a maid, I experienced a whole new world of closeness. On the flight to our honeymoon, we even joined the Mile High Club. Once we arrived, the cab ride to the hotel was anything but ordinary, as Bev couldn't keep her hands off me. I was overwhelmed by this new sexual experience, feeling both embarrassed and intrigued by emotions I had never encountered before. When we got to our room, we showered together. She emerged a little later wearing a sheer nightgown that left nothing to the imagination. She lay on the bed and, in a soft voice, said, "Sweetie, this is our wedding night. It's time to consummate our union." Our first time together was intense. We spent most of the night having sex and nearly missed our flight to Hawaii the next morning. Exhausted, we slept through most of the flight. I won't go into details, but during our 2 weeks in Hawaii, we had a lot of sex. By the end of our honeymoon, I felt like I had become an expert. I wondered why I'd never thought about sex before. Bev's experience was clearly not from books or movies, but her past didn't bother me. During our first year, Bev told me about her relationship with Buster. They had been serious, but after graduation, she realized he wasn't going anywhere. He ended up working in construction, got caught stealing, and became known to the police. Eventually, he moved to Philadelphia, and she lost track of him. Life was great for us until about a month ago. Our 10th high school reunion was approaching. I wasn't too interested in going, but Bev was excited to reconnect with old friends. Many had moved away, married, or disappeared, so we decided to attend. We sent in our RSVP with the reunion fee. The committee rented a ballroom for the event, and each class had a hospitality suite. The night before the reunion, we talked about what to expect. I reminded Bev that everyone was 10 years older and likely married, but she was eager to see her old friends. She listed off names but didn't mention Buster, so I asked if he'd be there. She paused and said she didn't know, but if he was, I didn't need to worry. He was a loser. On reunion night, Bev looked stunning in a beige cocktail dress that showed off her amazing figure. I was proud to be with her and knew she'd turn heads. She asked if I approved, and I responded with a passionate kiss. As I pulled away, she teased, "Don't get your motor running too soon or too fast, Buster." I wasn't sure if it was just a word choice or something more, but she headed back to put on her lipstick before we left. At the hotel, we got our name badges and mini yearbooks with old photos and updated names for married women. Bev was quickly swept up in greetings and compliments from her old friends, while I mingled with a few guys I had known. It took over half an hour to get Bev to the main ballroom, where she was again surrounded by her friends. I shuffled around until the dinner call was made. I glanced through the yearbook and didn't see Buster's picture, which was a relief. Some people who couldn't attend had sent notes and paid the fee to support the reunion. When Bev asked if she could sit with her old friends, I was disappointed but didn't say so. I ended up at a table with other spouses, far from Bev. Dinner was dull, and I remembered why I hadn't wanted to come. After some speeches and a toast, the bar and dance floor opened. I heard a commotion near Bev's table and saw Buster step up to her. She threw her arms around his neck and gave him a kiss. Then he took her hand and led her to the dance floor. I was furious. I walked onto the dance floor, tapped Buster on the shoulder, and said, "The first and last dance belongs to the spouse." Bev gasped and said, "Honey, you remember Buster, don't you?" I replied coldly, "Yeah, I remember. This dance is mine." Buster, not recognizing me from school, reluctantly stepped aside. After he left, Bev criticized me for not being friendlier. I realized Bev had been drinking a lot. I apologized, but told her I never liked Buster, and that hadn't changed. I added, "You ditched me before dinner, and now you're jumping into someone else's arms. Am I just extra baggage tonight?" She smiled, apologized, and said she just wanted to catch up with old friends. "We have a lifetime together," she said. "Don't rein me in too tight." I wasn't happy, but we finished the dance. I told her to have a good time, but asked her to ease up on the drinking. She promised to save some dances for me, but seemed annoyed and said, "Don't be a stick in the mud. I know how to handle my booze." I sat alone, frustrated, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Penny, an old classmate. We talked briefly, and she warned me to keep an eye on Bev and Buster. I reassured her that I trusted Bev, but she advised me to stay alert. After Penny left, another old friend, Glinda, approached. We danced and caught up, but when I glanced at the dance floor, I saw Bev and Buster dancing far too closely. I excused myself, went to cut in, and Buster snarled at me, telling me to get off the floor. Bev, clearly drunk, giggled as he shoved me. His old teammates moved in, and I realized I was outmatched, so I backed off. Later, Penny came over and told me Buster was angry after realizing I was the nerd from school. Bev, drunk, was joining in on jokes at my expense. I was quietly seething. When Buster stepped away, I asked Bev to dance, hoping to defuse the situation. She loudly refused, and when I suggested we go home, she snapped, "I'm not ready to go yet, so piss off." As I reached for Bev, one of Buster's buddies grabbed my arm and slurred, "Bev said she's not ready. What didn't you get?" Now, 3 of Buster's friends surrounded me. I tried again. "Bev, it's time to go." 2 of them grabbed me and threw me across the dance floor, knocking down 2 couples. The crowd, used to Buster's bullying, just stepped aside. Meanwhile, Bev laughed and pointed at me, saying, "Go sit down until I'm ready. I'll tell you when it's time to leave." Buster and his gang took over the dance floor, and nobody dared to intervene. I knew I had no support to confront them, so I accepted an invitation to sit with Penny, Glinda, and their husbands. I couldn't bear watching Bev and Buster anymore, so I turned away, trying to enjoy the conversation. I told them, "I didn't expect to see Buster here. Bev was sure he wouldn't show." Penny gasped, "You didn't see the last mailing? Buster's name was listed, but he hadn't paid for the dinner or reunion. He must have hitched a ride." My stomach knotted as I realized Bev had lied about doubting he'd show up. After 1 a.m., Penny returned with bad news. "There's action in the hospitality suite, and you're not going to like it." I stood, but Penny grabbed my arm. "Cliff, don't go. You'll just get hurt," I replied. "That's my wife. I can't just sit here." I rushed upstairs and barged into the suite. What I saw made my blood boil. Bev was provocatively dancing with Buster, her dress up around her hips, underwear gone. Buster had no pants on either. The crowd was chanting, "Go, Buster, go," as they danced suggestively. I moved toward them, but 2 of Buster's friends grabbed me. The dance stopped, and Buster sneered, "Well, if it isn't our favorite nerd riding in to save the fair maiden." Everyone laughed. Buster taunted, "If you want her, come and take her." His friends shoved me toward him, and Buster punched me hard in the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for air, he mocked, Get up and fight for her, nerd. Bev walked over, mocking me too. Don't you love me enough to fight? I thought I married a man. Buster lifted me by my shirt, ready to punch me again, but then laughed. He's not worth bruising my knuckles. Tie him to a chair so we can watch a real man in action. They tied me up, and the crowd cheered as Bev began undressing. I screamed, Bev, stop! Let's go home! Buster sneered. This is what a woman needs, not someone like you. Bev slapped me and said, Right, Buster, sweetie. Then they stuffed a napkin in my mouth to keep me quiet, as Buster and Bev had Zex in front of me, cheered on by the crowd. When they finished, Buster untied me and challenged me. Let's settle this like men. Whoever wins takes her home. I pulled the napkin from my mouth and warned Bev, there will be consequences for this. Stop now. She barely looked at me. I'm busy. Besides, you haven't won yet. I glared at Buster. Screw you. But before I could react, he punched me again, and I flew into the hallway. Lying there, I heard the doors slam and the laughter from inside, with Bev's voice joining in. I staggered to my feet, cleaned up in the restroom, and returned to the ballroom. Most guests had left or were leaving, but Penny and her husband were still there. As soon as she saw me, Penny hurried over, concerned. Cliff, I'm so sorry. I had a feeling this would happen with Buster around. He didn't book a room and may try to bring Bev home with him, and probably Jimmy too. At that moment, I solidified my plan. I'd overheard them discussing going to Jack's house after the hotel. After saying my goodbyes, I grabbed my cell phone from the car and called my friend, Sergeant Tim Albright at the police station. Tim, it's Cliff. You'll want to know about this. There are cars leaving soon, and I'm sure the drivers are well over the limit. Tim chuckled. I'll send 3 cars right away. Always happy to return the favor to Buster. After hanging up, I searched the ballroom and found Buster's jacket with his driver's license and car keys. His car was a rental, so I went outside, found it, and removed the valve stem from the front tire. Then I called the rental company to confirm that emergency service would take over an hour to arrive. On my way out, I saw Tim blocking the intersection with his cruiser. He waved and asked, They still in there? I nodded. They'll be out soon. Want to watch? I parked around the corner and returned to watch the show. Within 20 minutes, 9 cars were pulled over and all drivers were arrested. Some spouses were too drunk to drive, so police drove them home. Others had their cars towed. Tim walked over. What about Buster and your wife? They've been delayed, I said, just as my phone rang. It was Bev, drunk and angry. Where the hell are you? Why didn't you wait for me? I replied calmly. You made it clear I wasn't man enough for you tonight. Tell Baldwin to take care of you. I hung up, but a few minutes later, Bev called again, more civil. Buster's bringing me home after he fixes a flat. I invited him and Jimmy to stay over. Be nice, I snapped. You better find a way to dump them and get yourself home. I turned off my phone and told Tim what happened. He offered to come with me. We drove home, and he parked his cruiser next door, hidden behind the fence. He also had a car follow Buster to ensure nothing dangerous happened on the road. As we waited, I had an idea. Tim, you know those spike strips you use to stop cars? He caught on and smiled. I suppose it's possible they could fall out of a cruiser. We placed 2 spike strips in my driveway, positioned just right so they'd be invisible until Buster rolled over them. Tim smirked. I've heard of things like this happening, but this is the first time I've seen it. His radio crackled, confirming Buster had just left the hotel with 2 passengers. Tim told the officer to follow safely and let them reach their destination if possible. 20 minutes later, blue lights flashed outside. I had expected a loud noise when Buster hit the spike strips, but the air quietly escaped from his front tires. Tim and I watched through the window as Buster, Bev, and Jimmy stumbled out of the car, barely able to stand. Buster started making light threats to the officers, but soon one cuffed him and said, You're under arrest for DUI. Buster swore, and they had to force him into the cruiser. Tim whispered, Now he's resisting arrest. The officers checked Jimmy's license and found out he had nowhere to stay. They told him he'd be booked as a vagrant. Jimmy swung at one of the officers and missed, which earned him a head slam onto the car in handcuffs. That's attack on an officer, Tim murmured. Meanwhile, another officer, having secured Buster, questioned Bev and walked her to the door. Her language was unrepeatable. I let her in, and the officer saw Tim. Hi, Sergeant, he greeted. Tim asked me, Need anything else? Bev slurred, You set this up. Where are Buster and Jimmy going? I calmly replied, Yes, I did, and they're headed to jail for drunk driving. Bev shouted, I'm going to bail them out. Tim stepped forward and warned her, If you go anywhere near the road, you'll be joining them. She tried to slap him, but I grabbed her arm and said, Go to bed, Bev, or you'll see a side of me you won't like. She glared but stumbled to the bedroom. Tim looked at me and said, "Call the rental agency about the car. They'll pick it up." I thanked him, and he left. Bev passed out on the bed, and I slept on the couch. Before dawn, I took her checkbook, cash, and canceled our joint credit card. Most of my money was already in safe, separate accounts. The next day, Bev came to the table looking awful. She didn't make eye contact as I handed her coffee. She mumbled a thanks and started to cry. After a few minutes, she said, "I'm so sorry. I was pretty bad, wasn't I?" I replied, "I wish pretty bad covered it." Before she could respond, the phone rang. It was Buster asking for bail. Bev told me she needed to go. I pushed her back into her chair. "No, Bev. You're not bailing him out. Your checkbook, cash, and credit card are gone. You're not using our money for this." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean, gone?" I leaned in firm. "I'm not sure our marriage can be saved after last night, but let me be clear. If Buster comes near you again, or you even mention him, we're done. Do you understand?" She nodded, sobbing. Buster ended up spending 2 days in jail because no one bailed him out. He was fined for the DUI and rental car damage, which wiped out his savings. He hitchhiked back to town, broke. Jimmy got out a day earlier, but had to borrow money to leave town. Their weekend ended up costing them both. Tim later told me 8 others pleaded guilty to DUI, getting 500 fines and 6-month suspensions. One repeat offender was fined $1,500 and lost his license for a year. I wasn't shedding any tears for them. Bev and I barely spoke for days. I waited for her to make the first move. If her parents hadn't moved nearby, I might have sent her to stay with them. On Wednesday night, as we were getting ready for bed, Bev approached me. "Can we try to repair the damage?" she asked, hugging me and seeking a kiss. I pulled back. "The damage won't be repaired in bed, and we won't have Zex until you get a full medical exam. I'm not risking anything after what you did with Buster." Shocked, she protested, "Buster isn't carrying anything. How could you think that?" I stared at her. "People who sleep around tend to pick things up. You acted like a courtesan. Get checked before you spread anything, and you'll see Dr. Matthews for certification." She begged to go to someone else, but I insisted. She cried all night. The next day, she hugged me, apologized, and said she'd gone to Dr. Matthews. Results would be back the next day. After dinner, she admitted, "I've been thinking a lot about last weekend. I'm sorry. I know you said not to mention him, but you know who I mean. We were lovers in high school, and Saturday night wasn't the first time something like that happened." I interrupted, "Why did you lie to me about Buster being there?" She hesitated, then admitted, "I was afraid you'd refuse to go if you knew he'd be there." I glared. "You knew what would happen at the reunion, didn't you? You planned it." She flinched, then confessed, "Cliff, you knew who I was before we married. I've always loved Zex, and I still want it with other people." Her words hit me hard. I asked, "How long have you been screwing Buster? Since we got married?" She insisted this was the first time since high school. I sat in silence, feeling sick. "Bev, you've told me more than you think. I won't press further now, but understand this. If you want to have Zex with others, ask for a divorce. Our vows are not negotiable." Sobbing, she said, "Cliff, you don't understand." "No, Bev," I replied. "You don't understand. If you can't stay faithful, we can't repair this." I reminded her that our plans to start a family were on hold indefinitely. "We have a lot to fix first, and I'm not bringing children into this mess." She apologized again, crying, and begged for a chance to make things right, suggesting that having a family would help. I told her firmly, "We can try to fix this, but I don't trust you, and we are not starting a family now." She was beginning to grasp the depth of the damage she had caused. Over the next few weeks, we had several discussions and set benchmarks to track our progress. Over the next year and a half, things improved. One thing that surprised and reassured me was that after our argument following the reunion, Bev never mentioned wanting to have Zex with others again. About a month ago, we started talking about having a family, and I began to feel hopeful. But the memories of that night still lingered, and I questioned whether I could truly move past it. I knew I had to protect my interests and ensure I had a way out of the marriage without financial loss, just in case. Every 4 to 6 weeks, Bev started spending a few days with her parents. We agreed she'd call me at 9 p.m. each night. She was a way to stay connected. I liked that this arrangement gave her time with her family while we still had our weekends together. Since I couldn't join her, I gave her $200 each trip to take her parents out. Bev seemed refreshed after each visit, enjoying her time with her parents and reconnecting with old friends. On her last trip, I had some free time and decided to call her. When her mom answered, I asked for Bev, but her mom told me she was at a slumber party at Janice's house and wouldn't be back until morning. I was surprised. "Isn't it kind of early for a slumber party?" Her mom explained that Bev and her friends often got together and sometimes stayed overnight. Then she added something odd. Bev hadn't taken them out in a long time. This confused me since I'd given Bev over $1,000 for that very reason. I called Bev's cell, but it was off. When she finally called later, I asked why she hadn't mentioned the slumber parties. She replied that it hadn't seemed important. When I asked about her phone, she said the battery had died and she left it charging at home. Her answers didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Later, I realized I didn't have Janice's number, so I picked up my phone to call Bev's cell again by accident. To my surprise, Bev answered. Startled, I disguised my voice and said, "Mabel?" She replied, "You must have the wrong number," and hung up. The alarms in my head were getting louder. Something was definitely going on. She was lying about the cell phone, and I started to wonder what else she might be hiding. When Bev returned, things seemed normal, but I was now suspicious about her visits to her parents. The story about the hen parties felt weak. We usually shared everything, and I couldn't believe she wouldn't mention these gatherings unless she was hiding something. I concluded the parties were a cover for something she didn't want me or her parents to know about. I began asking more about Janice, whether she worked and how she hosted these parties. Bev said Janice worked, but someone had a key, and the group often met at her house after work. Sometimes they went out for dinner or ordered takeout. When Bev told me about her next trip to see her parents, I decided to take time off and do some snooping. I told both Bev and my coworkers that I had business in Chicago and would be unreachable except by cell phone. Bev left on Tuesday morning, planning to return Friday evening. I gave her a vague story about meetings with clients and moving between hotels. Before she left, she asked if she should take her parents out like usual. I was suspicious again, wondering if she really was taking them out. So I told her I didn't have cash and suggested she put it on her credit card. She frowned and said, "Maybe we just won't go out this time." I wished her a safe trip and later rented a car to follow her. I checked into a motel near her parents' house, conveniently located so I could see her comings and goings. That night, nothing happened. Bev made a quick trip to the pharmacy and came back home. She called at 9 p.m. as planned, and we had a normal conversation. When I asked if she'd have her hen party, she laughed and said yes, they'd get together the next night. Since her last trip, I had gotten Janice's address and phone number. I learned from Bev's mom that Janice had a short, failed marriage and worked at a bank. On Wednesday, I saw Bev leave her parents' house and followed her to Janice's. There were 2 cars parked outside. One was a Camry, and the other was an old Ford with Pennsylvania plates. I thought I saw Janice and a male figure greet Bev as she arrived. I parked at a nearby barn where I could observe without being seen. After picking up a quick meal, I settled in and watched the house. Nothing more happened that night, and I stayed hidden, waiting for answers. At 9, Bev called as usual. There were no background sounds, and she said she was at Janice's with her girlfriends. Something felt off. There were no other cars, and I hadn't seen anyone arrive. Either they were dropped off while I was at the truck stop, or no one else had come. As we were about to hang up, I asked, "How many of you are there?" She lightly replied, "It's not a hen party, but there are usually 6 or 7 of us. Tonight, only 2 others came." Her answer matched what I had seen, so I settled in for the wait. Around midnight, I walked closer to Janice's house, but didn't hear anything, which made sense if there were only a few people. After listening for a while, I returned to my spot. At 2 in the morning, I saw some movement. Bev and another person walked to her car and stood there for a few minutes, though it was too dark to see much. Bev eventually drove off, but no one else left the house. Odd. Back at the motel, I saw her car, confirming she was home. The next day, I drove by Janice's house and noticed the Camry was gone. Assuming it belonged to Janice, I checked the bank parking lots and found it there. I didn't learn much, but decided to stake out Janice's house early that day. Around 3:30, I set up in the thicket again. It was a nice day, and I had a book and a picnic supper to pass the time. Shortly before 6, the Camry returned, and a woman went into the house. I regretted not having binoculars. Later, I heard a car door slam and saw the old Ford leave. I could only make out a man driving, likely the same one I had seen the night before. Then, I noticed a man and a woman on the porch, adding to my confusion. By 7, the lights were on at Janice's, but no one else had arrived or left. Unsure of what was happening, I debated staying or going back to the motel. I figured I could spot Bev's car if she headed back to Janice's. Something was clearly going on. When I arrived at the motel, I was shocked to see Bev's car parked next to the old Ford from Pennsylvania. I sat for a few minutes trying to process it. A horrible thought crossed my mind, so I checked the Ford and found it unlocked. Inside, it was a mess. Trash, clothing, and food wrappers everywhere. I opened the glove box and found the registration. My heart sank. The car was registered to Baldwin Snipes. Buster was here. Bev was with him again. As always, I'm quick to make a plan before acting. When I spotted Buster's wallet on the passenger seat, it all came together. I took his driver's license, a few cards with his name and the registration, then tossed the wallet back. Next, I unlocked Bev's car with my spare key, found her purse, and took her driver's license and credit card. While grabbing her wallet, I found a box of rubbers with several missing and a receipt from the day before, confirming what I'd suspected. Her cell phone was missing too. After putting everything back, I locked the car and went to my room. In my room, I called a college buddy in Pennsylvania and explained the situation. I gave him Buster's license, registration info, and phone number, and asked him to call the Pennsylvania State Police from a payphone, pretending to be Buster and reporting his car stolen. My friend was happy to help. Then I checked Bev's credit card account online. There was a motel charge from earlier that day and a $200 cash advance from the day before. It seemed she was paying Buster to sleep with her and even providing the rubbers. I also found a similar charge from a different motel a couple of months ago. Since this was Bev's card and she managed it, I hadn't paid much attention to it. She'd complained about the $1,000 limit but never made a big deal. I don't think she knew I had access to all our accounts. I called the credit card company and reported her card stolen earlier that day, explaining that it had been left at home while she was out of town. I flagged the motel charge as fraudulent but left the $200 cash advance for her to deal with. Finally, I made an anonymous call to the local police, reporting a suspicious car at the motel. Then I disposed of everything I'd taken, including the cut-up credit card in the trash. I didn't care what room they were in. You can fool me once, but not twice. It was satisfying to see everything fall into place, even the parts I hadn't planned. About half an hour after making my calls, I heard a commotion outside. The hotel clerk was telling someone to pay cash or leave because their credit card had been reported stolen. I recognized Buster's voice angrily threatening the clerk, while Bev tried to explain it was a mistake. Buster must have intimidated the clerk, as I heard the door slam and saw the clerk return to the office, where he immediately called the police. They arrived within 5 minutes, spoke with the clerk, and headed toward the room beneath mine. I heard the police knocking, followed by angry voices. One officer checked the license plates of both cars, then ran a check in the cruiser. Soon after, I saw Bev and Buster, handcuffed, being led to the police car. Another officer brought out a plastic bag, likely containing their personal items. About an hour later, a tow truck came for Buster's car. Although disrupting their night gave me some satisfaction, I still felt sick. I sat in my darkened room wondering how things had gotten to this point and what I should do next. Unsurprisingly, Bev didn't make her usual 9 p.m. call. I left a message on her voicemail, expressing concern. Around 10 o'clock, I saw her dad leaving the house in his car, but couldn't tell if her mom was with him. I called her mother, but there was no answer, so I left a message asking her to have Bev call me when she got home. This part was the hardest for me. I had gotten really close to Bev's parents, especially her dad. He once told me how glad he was to have me as a son-in-law and how much he appreciated my positive influence on Bev. He also shared that he and Bev's mom had gone through a rough time with her during her last 2 years of high school. She was popular, but hung out with a crowd they didn't like. They had hoped she would graduate and go to college, but her grades were so poor she had to attend community college before eventually getting into a university. Her dad had almost been in tears when he told me how disappointed they were that she barely qualified for a diploma. He mentioned that the only person ranked lower than her in class was her no-good, muscle-bound boyfriend, Buster. We often talked about her, and I knew there was more he wasn't saying. It didn't surprise me when he said he banned Buster from their house in their junior year. Unfortunately, he couldn't stop her from seeing him. He had even considered early retirement and moving before her junior year, but now he regretted not following his instincts. Our marriage had been a bright spot for her parents. After finishing some emails, I decided I didn't want to stay until morning. Bev was coming home in the afternoon, and I had things to do before she arrived. I packed my stuff and went to the office to check out. It was close to midnight when I was about to get into my car, and another car pulled into the lot. It was Bev's parents. They stopped behind Bev's car, and her mom, who I hadn't seen earlier, got out and went to Bev's car. With the doors open, I could hear Bev crying in the back seat, and her dad didn't sound too happy. Both cars left and headed home. As I drove home, I thought about what had happened. Yes, I was hurt beyond belief, but it was clear that what Bev really wanted was an easy life, and also an affair. I couldn't live with that. She had shown me this twice that I knew of, and probably more behind my back. I was foolish to think she had changed, or would change. By the time I got home, I had accepted reality. We were done. If she hadn't done this behind my back, I might have been more forgiving. But since she did, I figured that if I were generous, I'd only be benefiting that SOB buster. I decided to cut her off completely. Bev didn't know that there were photos of many of their escapades, some taken during the reunion. Penny, an old friend of mine, had made sure I got copies of the reunion photos for future use, as she put it. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but now it made sense. I hadn't even looked at those pictures because I didn't need to, but now I realized they could be useful. Around 9 the next morning, I called Bev's house. Her mother answered, and I could tell from her voice she was upset. She said they had received my message, but by the time she gave it to Bev, it was too late to call. She added, "Bev is still in bed. She had a rough night." I replied, "Yeah, I know." She asked what I meant, and I said, "That's not important right now. Please wake Bev up. I need to talk to her. I'll call back in 15 minutes. Her mom started to say something, but I hung up. When I called back, her mother answered again and said, "Bev still isn't up yet, but she'll call you this afternoon before she heads home. She's not up for talking right now." I was trying to stay calm, but my patience was running out. I said, "Mom, Bev is supposed to be home this afternoon before dinner, not just leaving. Please go tell her right now that I know exactly what's going on, and it's in her best interest to come to the phone immediately." Her mom sounded unsure. "Cliff, please be patient. Bev's okay, but she had a really bad time last night. I can't discuss it right now, but please be patient. She'll call this afternoon." I took a breath and replied, "Mom, if all I needed to talk to her about was her getting arrested last night, I'd wait. But this is about a lot more than a few hours in jail." There was dead silence on the other end for a moment, and I wasn't sure if the call had disconnected. Then, in a low voice, her mom said, "Hold on," and went to get her. A moment later, I heard Bev scream, "What? How does he know?" Her mom said something I couldn't make out, and a few moments later, Bev got on the phone. She had regained her composure and said in an overly sweet voice, "Hi, honey, what's this? You told Mom I was in jail? Why would you say that?" I paused for a moment and then said, "Bev, please don't call me honey anymore. I'm sorry for bringing up the fact that you were in jail, but let's drop the act. Actually, I should have said you and your boy toy Buster were taken to jail. You've apparently been meeting and sleeping with him ever since your parents moved back near Philadelphia." There was silence. Finally, in a weak voice, she said, "I'll be home tonight. Can we talk about this then?" "Oh, absolutely not," I shot back. "Don't even think about coming here. There's nothing left to talk about. All you need to do is listen to what I'm saying right now." She begged, "Please, Cliff, not here, where Mom and Dad can hear." "First off, Bev, I don't think your parents are going to hear anything new. They already know you're basically a cheap street hooker, and I guess you didn't catch what I said. I didn't mention a discussion. I said you better listen to what I'm telling you right now. You don't have a home to come back to anymore. There's no home, and there's no husband. The house is going on the market Monday, and you can come pick up whatever you want before it's sold." I continued, "Since I realized I couldn't trust you after the reunion, I refinanced the house. You can expect to get a share of the equity, but it won't be more than $5,000 to $8,000. Our savings account had about $5,000 in it, and half of that is yours." I could hear her start to stammer, but I kept going. "Just so you know, I paid myself a salary of $2,500 a month, and after the divorce, you'll get maybe $1,000 a month in alimony. And to be honest, I'll fight to pay you as little as possible. You can keep the car," I added, "but you'll need to take over the $525 monthly payments right away. There are only 34 payments left, and I won't be making any more." She started cursing at me, and when I mentioned alimony, she screamed, "You make way more than that. I'm going to sue for $10,000 a month in alimony." She lost it when I said, "Yeah, I make more than $2,500 a month, but besides that salary, the company deposits a monthly dividend into my offshore bank account, and you won't get a dime of it." She screamed more profanities, and I heard her dad yell at her that he'd slap her if she didn't stop her foul mouth. I calmly said, "I thought you didn't want your parents hearing all this. You've left me no choice but to file for divorce. And you better get a job fast because Buster sure can't support himself, let alone you two. Oh, and by the way, you'll have access to $125 a month from our checking account until the divorce is finalized." She cursed again, and the line went dead. Not long after, I heard a sharp crack. I think her dad actually slapped her. Then I heard him scream at her to get out of the house until she could act like a lady. A few minutes later, my cell phone rang. It was Bev's dad. He apologized for her behavior and told me she was packing to come home and that she was bringing Buster with her to knock me up. I told him not to worry about me. I'd be out of the house before they got there. During our conversation, he admitted that he had slapped her, and he started to cry, saying her face was swollen and that he had never punched anyone before. That was the final straw for me. There was no way I could love or live with someone so self-absorbed that she didn't care who she hurt. My heart ached for her parents. That was 5 years ago. Looking at things now, I guess I have to admit that being a successful businessman doesn't erase my nerdy side. I've doubled the size of my business and plan to double it again in the next 5 years. I've only seen Bev twice since our divorce was finalized about a year after that night. In the divorce, the judge gave her a little leniency because I hadn't disclosed all the financial information I was supposed to. But due to her blatant infidelity, the judge only awarded her 20% of what she could have gotten. She was awarded $800 a month in alimony until she remarried. Every year on our anniversary, I send her a check for $9,600 to cover the year's payments. I do it this way so I don't have to think about her constantly and to remind her of what she threw away. When I look back at my short first marriage, I remember all the times Bev said she loved me. I've had to wonder many times, was it ever true? The night I ended things, as you know, both Bev and Buster were hauled off to jail. Bev was allowed to call her parents, and with some difficulty, they arranged bail for her. It wasn't easy to handle after 10 p.m. in a small town, but her dad managed to settle things with the motel, and she returned to court the following week. Any charges against her were dropped. Buster, however, spent 2 days in jail until they figured out that the stolen car report was a mistake. He was released on Monday. From the records I've gathered, and based on what Bev's parents told me, this wasn't their first rendezvous. In fact, it was at least the 12th. 7 happened before the reunion, and 5 more after. When I got home, I went through our credit card statements. Bev had kept them all neatly organized. I found 7 airline and hotel charges going back to shortly after we were married. All of them were for Philadelphia and matched up with trips I had taken out of town. On this last trip, Buster had even brought along his buddy Jimmy, who apparently hit it off with Janice. That night, they ended up having a quaternion. The next night, Bev and Buster wanted time alone, so Bev rented a motel room. Since Bev couldn't get Buster out of jail, she spent the next 2 days with Janice. When she returned to her parents' house, her father had kicked her out. On Monday, Bev came home with Buster. But by then, I had already moved all my personal belongings to an apartment and taken 2 weeks off for a vacation in Aruba. They tried to find me, and I'm sure Buster's main reason for coming with Bev was to knock me up. When they couldn't track me down, they trashed the house. They broke furniture, smashed windows, destroyed china, punched holes in the walls, tore down light fixtures, emptied the fridge and pantry onto the carpet, and even threw a chair through the glass shower. In short, they wrecked the place. The realtor called me Tuesday night to inform me of the damage. I told her to have it cleaned and repaired and to send me the bill. I would deduct the costs from Bev's share when we closed. In the end, the house cleared $12,000 after repairs, which cost about $4,000. I got the $6,000 I was owed, and Bev only netted $2,000. Bev tried to deny she trashed the house, but I had 3 neighbors who witnessed the destruction. She didn't fight the claim. When Buster and Jimmy returned to Philadelphia, they had been gone over a week, and both lost their jobs. They had to panhandle and sleep in Buster's car until they found work 2 weeks later. After getting new jobs, Buster became a ward of the state. He couldn't work construction anymore due to injuries from a coworker who was angry Buster had slept with his wife. After that, Buster worked at a telemarketing company. 2 weeks after the incident in Bev's hometown, I met her dad for lunch. He seemed nervous when we sat down. We had a pleasant meal, and after some small talk, he apologized for how things turned out. He repeatedly thanked me for trying to help Bev, and expressed how heartbroken he was when he found out what happened. He said Bev's troubles began when she became a popular, attractive young woman in high school, but gravitated toward the wrong crowd. He found out about her sexual activities late in her sophomore year, And despite his and her mom's efforts to talk to her, it didn't help. The biggest shock came when he told me that Buster had gotten her pregnant at the end of her junior year. They managed to keep the abortion quiet due to summer break. Bev never told me about the abortion. Her dad also revealed that she had been treated for an STD just before the next school year began. This was when he banned Buster from their house. He later learned the pregnancy and STD might not have been from Buster, though it likely was. He didn't realize until much later that Bev had become the high school bicycle. Bev's story is sad. 2 weeks after our breakup, and after Buster got a new job, she moved to Philadelphia to live with him and Jimmy. I don't know how she supported herself, but I can guess. 2 months later, she had another abortion. It wasn't mine since I had been using rubbers ever since we gave up on having a family. Ironically, I had been ready to start a family just before she betrayed me again. Whether it was Buster's baby or not, I believe it was. 6 months later, Bev left Buster around the time he was badly knocked by a coworker for sleeping with his wife. She returned to her parents' house and now works as a waitress at a local coffee shop. She's gained about 40 pounds and no longer looks like the cheerleader she once was. I've heard she's changed quite a bit, largely because her dad keeps her under strict rules. She's allowed to stay with her parents as long as she follows his guidelines. Most of this information has come from her dad. I don't visit them since Bev is still there, but her dad and I talk a few times a year. He called me yesterday and said he'd be in town soon and wanted to talk. He mentioned clearing the air about a lot of things. I'm not sure how I feel about that conversation, but it might answer some lingering questions. This week has been interesting. I met with Bev's dad and he told me more than I care about now. But he did surprise me with one thing. Bev had finally confessed to him that she had married me mostly for financial stability. She just couldn't tear herself away from Buster and the rough exhibitionist sex he offered. She told her dad she regretted letting sex and exhibitionism take over her life. When Buster got her pregnant for the second time while living in Philadelphia, she realized her mistake. She said she had been nothing more than a sex toy for him. He even pimped her out, giving her just enough money for groceries and booze. He abandoned her when he found out she was pregnant. Worse, the abortion was botched, and she'll never be able to conceive again, even if she meets someone decent. I hadn't realized Buster's knocking didn't happen in Philadelphia. It occurred after he moved to Atlanta following their breakup. A friend of Bev's ran into Buster in Atlanta and barely recognized him. He's now a homeless street bum, thin, with broken and yellow teeth, a scraggly beard, and long hair. He's ruined many lives, including his own. Do I feel sorry for him? I'll let you decide. Now for the good part. On Saturday, the same week I met with Bev's dad, I took Penny out for dinner and dancing. Her husband had died in a plane crash about a month after the reunion. Penny and I started dating 4 months ago, and I proposed to her that night. The best part? She said yes. When we first started dating, she didn't think she wanted to marry again, but was glad to have companionship. I wasn't sure about a serious relationship either after what I'd been through. But after our 5th date, she invited me to dinner at her home, and I met her 2 kids. We hit it off, and I think that's when she reconsidered. She realized her children needed a father figure, and we found out we had a lot in common. By our 3rd month together, it seemed inevitable. She was still hesitant, but that Saturday night, I went all in, and she accepted. We married a few months later and just celebrated our 25th anniversary. We added a little boy to our family about 18 months after we married. I sold my business and retired 2 years ago. The kids are grown, and we moved to a beautiful home on Hilton Head Island. I rarely think about my past. Bev's parents passed away several years ago. It was sad, but also a relief. My talks with her dad were never happy and always kept the memory of my first marriage alive. I have no idea where Bev is now, and while it might sound heartless, I really don't care. Although I admit on rare occasions when she crosses my mind, I feel a little sorry for her. And yes, I have to acknowledge that in some strange way, she played a role in my transformation from a nerd to an average Joe. Maybe a little more adventurous than the average Joe. But after everything that's happened, I'm happy now. You can't imagine how much it means when Penny says, "I love you." And I know it's real.